Welcome, brave souls, to the chilling depths of horror in detail, the realm where the shadows whisper ancient secrets and nightmares come to life. I am your guide through the darkness, and on this channel, we delve into the spine-chilling world of Wendigo horror stories that will send shivers down your spine. First story, The Hunt for a Wendigo. Ever since I found out about Wendigos, I've been obsessed with them. They're mythical creatures that are rooted in the Algonquin-based Native American folklore. They have heightened senses, they're extremely fast, unnaturally large, and strong. These are all advantages that help them stalk their prey. I'm so intrigued by them because no one knows if they actually exist. I've spent hours researching about them. I know pretty much everything about them. The Wendigo is pretty much the embodiment of gluttony. Always consuming, yet never satisfied. They're always at the point of starvation. I've read about so many skinwalker and Wendigo encounters, but no one actually knows if the stories are true, so neither do I. That's why Rose, Charles, and I made a group for hunting mythical creatures. We go out into the forest sometimes to look for the creatures. We haven't had any luck yet. I love to talk to my grandpa about them, and hearing his stories about them are always the best. Every time he tells me a story at the end of it, he says don't go near the northern forests of the Atlantic coast and Great Lakes region of the United States and Canada. The thing about this is that I am too curious, and I live near the forest he talks about. It's 25 minutes away walking distance. I know my way around the forest because of my map, and it's so close to my house. I've been there before with my friends, but we've never been that deep into it. The doorbell rings as I get a message. I open my phone. The message says, "I'm here." I walk downstairs to the front so I can open the door. As I look through and open the door, I see Rose and Charles. "Hi," said Rose eagerly. Charles groans. "Hey, are you ready yet?" "We just walked here to make sure that you were ready," Rose added. "Yeah, come inside really quick. I have some stuff I need to grab," I insisted. Rose exclaimed, "I got a new tracker this weekend." "Is it actually a good one this time?" Charles murmured. Rose states sarcastically, Yes, I would totally buy a broken tracker." "I'm messing around with you, geez," Charles snickered. We all head out of the house and in the direction of the forest. About 30 minutes later, we make it to the edge of the forest. I take a deep breath, looking into the slight fog and menacing atmosphere of the viridian-tinted forest. Minutes passed until I broke my eyes free before entering the forest. This time the atmosphere was different. It was so thick, eerie, and it felt alive. I've never actually believed that I would encounter a Wendigo. We just enjoy going exploring and pretending that we'll run into it. We walked through the forest for what felt like hours. I knew it was the deepest we've ever gone in, and I had lost where we were on the map. Rose flustered with concern. "Hey, we've been walking for hours. Are you sure you know where we're going or how to get back?" "Yeah, don't worry, Rose, I have my map and compass with me. We came into the forest from the west, and we're heading north toward the caves," I reassured. "Everything looks the same around here," Rose scolded. "I mean, they're all just trees and bushes," Charles smirked. We walk deeper into the forest as dusk falls upon us. The golden pink horizon illuminated over the forest, leaves and shrubs, creating beautiful shadows. We walk for a little while until we stumble upon what looks like a slaughtered animal. All we see is red, blood red. The cedar trunks of the trees, the mossy green ground, the evergreen shrubs. Those colors were no longer vibrant greens, only objects doused in blood. I can't believe my eyes. There was no words, just silence. I couldn't tear my eyes from this gruesome, mutilated mess of whatever it was. Could an animal really do something like this? I questioned if we were alone in these woods. Minutes passed with terror in our bones, dead silence, no animals in sight. Not a single sound carried through the forest as the sun falls behind the horizon, until I hear a few branches breaking from in front of the bloodbath. I look ahead of the mess into the darkness, only to see two bright, frosty-colored eyes peering into my soul from within the obsidian-shaded forest. More branches break through the forest ahead of us, approaching closer, slowly stalking us in the darkness. As I look closer at this horrendous monster's outline, as it approaches, I see something hanging from its mouth. I think that it's a hunk of flesh, but I can't make it out. I fix my gaze towards its hand, and I'm instantly filled with terror. I knew what this was. I see a hunk of flesh in its mouth. Its unnaturally long and bony fingers are gripping onto a human head. It was the thing I've been looking for. I can't believe it. I never thought I would actually run across one of them. That face, the abnormally large body with skin stretched across all of its bones. I knew right then and there I had to run. I had to run for my life. It was now or never. Ah! Rose squealed as she realized what was in the forest with us. I turned around as fast as I could. My friends and I started running for our lives. Shortly after, I could hear it intently chasing after us. Branches snapping behind us as we run with no direction, the Wendigo lets out an inhumanly screech. My heart is pounding as we all hide, hoping the creature doesn't find us. We're all so exhausted and out of breath, yet trying not to move or make a sound. We listen closely as we hear cracking of twigs inching closer to our vicinity. That's when I heard the most eerie sound in my life. Not too far into the woods, I heard a soft voice of a little girl asking for help. "Help, please, someone come help me," pleaded the small girl. It can mimic voices? What is this? I mean, there can't be a little girl out here this deep in the forest all by herself, right? Without hesitation, Rose jumps out of her hiding spot and goes to try and help the small girl. "Hey, little girl dash," Rose murmured. Within a second of her speaking, I hear her vocals cut out, and I heard nothing else but the horrific sounds of something I couldn't even imagine. I look out from my hiding spot to see Rose completely mangled and her blood all over the soil. I couldn't believe it. Why did she do that? She knew it was after us. I can't help but stare, and my friend is just gone like that, and I couldn't even help her. I'm so sorry, Rose. We should have never come here. I brought you here, and I never should have done that. Hey, guys, you can come out now. It's safe. The monster ran away, Rose reassured. Oh my, Rose? How could it do this to us? It stole her voice, and now it's trying to lure us out. These things are sick. I heard what that thing did to her. She can't be alive. There's no way I could let it trick me like this. I look hastily at the creature from my hiding spot as I wait for my opportunity to run out of this place for good. It felt like I must have been waiting there for hours, waiting for this thing to leave, because it knew we were hiding somewhere there. Through the dark, ominous forest, there was stray beams of light and laughter approaching. The creature heard the laughter and branches and decided that it was done here. It wanted to go after whoever was over there, so that's when we took our chance to run west and get the hell out of that forest. I ran until my feet blistered. At the sight of lights, I sighed in relief, then collapsed to the ground as I'm panting, choking on the fresh air, bawling my eyes out with Charles. I feel sorry for those people, but I barely made it out alive myself. Rose wasn't as lucky as we were. I collected myself after crying and shaking on the ground for what felt like ages. I got up, gave the forest my last goodbye, and went on my way through the dark night illuminated by only stars in the sky and the empty streetlights. Never again have Charles or me mentioned this to each other or anyone again. It's buried as deep in our memories as far as they could go. Second story. My mom's voice was calling me from the woods, but she was home. Yesterday, February 15th, I was walking back home after hanging out with some friends. Before anyone asks, I was completely sober and in my right mind. I've never been afraid to walk alone in the dark. I'm quite tall and intimidating looking from a distance, and I always bring a pocket knife when I know I'll be walking in the dark. Anyways, I was walking past some woods on the way back to my house, and I heard my mother's voice call, "Gabriel, help," from inside the woods. I immediately recognized her voice and turned to look into the woods. She kept calling my name over and over. I couldn't see anything. It was far too dark to see through the trees. "Mom!" I called back, heading towards the woods. She sounded like she was in trouble and scared. I assumed that she had gone for a run like she did every night and somehow got lost in the woods. Then I realized it couldn't be her. She had texted me only 10 minutes before, asking me to come home soon to watch my little sister so she could go on a run. I stopped dead in my tracks and called my mom. The voice in the woods still calling my name and getting more frantic by the second. She picked up and I immediately asked her if she was in the woods. She said no, she was back home with my little sister. I swear to God, as soon as she said she was back home, her voice stopped calling my name from inside the woods. I was overcome with a wave of dread and fear that I had never felt before. Something in the woods was trying to lure me in using my mother's voice, and it knew my full name, not just my nickname, which made things even scarier because the only person who calls me Gabriel is my mom. I immediately turned and ran faster than I have ever run before back home. When I got back home, my legs felt like jello and my lungs burned. I opened the door, and there was my mom sitting on the couch with my sister. I would think this was some sort of prank, but my mom isn't one for pranks, and even if she was, there is no way she could have gotten home before me without me seeing her. My only question is, what was in the woods? Edit. Since a lot of people have asked, yes, I did tell my mom what I heard. She doubted me at first, but I was able to convince her I was serious. She promised to not run through those woods anymore and not to run at night. Third story. Strangers in woods acting. Strange when they don't believe they are being watched. So I'm not exactly a paranormal believer per se, but I've had a couple of experiences while hunting or hiking that I just can't explain rationally. The most unnerving one happened probably 7 or 8 years ago. Normally I'd hunt on some property that my family owns. I don't even remember the reason anymore that I decided to hunt on public land this time. Probably just a change of scenery. I remember that it was evening in fall, but it was a fairly uncharacteristically warm day. I got to the access road and pulled off to the spot where everyone pulls off to park and walk in, and noticed there were a couple of old boys already there. Nothing too weird about them, except there is no truck or vehicle for them to have pulled in on. They also didn't have guns with them, but were dressed in hunter orange. But at the time, I just figured that they were backpackers or campers. There's not too far from this spot and a campground, and it's not uncommon for folks to spend weekends away from their family for some peace and quiet for their hunting trip. Anyways, they seemed friendly enough, and there was absolutely nothing said to make them seem any different than hundreds of other fellows I've met hunting. They were just a couple of hillbillies from the sounds of it. We shot the shit for a couple of minutes. They took off, and I sat on my phone for a bit trying to give them a head start because I was afraid they'd drive off the squirrels. Except I clearly didn't wait long enough. Probably like 10 minutes up the trail, it curved to the left, but I heard noises coming directly from ahead. It sounded bigger than a squirrel, but I also like seeing any sort of animals, and it didn't sound too far off the main path. When I crept off the path, the ground started to drop, so I was able to look down and see my new pals, but not acting right at all. This is going to be hard to explain without a visual, but they just weren't moving like normal people. Their movements were jerky, and it's almost like they'd forgotten that things like knees and other joints were able to bend. I didn't stick around long because, frankly, it was fucking terrifying. I backed away slow and quiet to the trail and then hauled ass back to my car. I've spoken with several of the more open-minded outdoorsmen in the area, and none of them had ever heard of anything like that. Drugs were the most common theory that I've heard, and I know that's the logical assumption, but man, I've seen folks on a lot of different drugs, and those movements just look too scarily unnatural. I've done some Googling in the years since for similar incidents in my area, but have yet to find anything that sounds like it. Fourth story. Wendigo encounter. I've been debating on sharing this story with anyone outside of my small circle of people that were there. But I want to share my experience in hopes that it saves someone's life or to give understanding of what someone else has experienced. Late fall 2010. In northern Canada, I went deep into the wilderness with my father and my eldest brother to hunt for moose. We left in the early morning, just before sunrise, trying to cover as much distance as possible before nightfall. We traveled winding rivers and had to repeatedly portage over rapids all day. We decided to set up camp just over halfway to our destination. My father figured that we'd make the rest of the journey tomorrow. Well, when everyone bedded down for the night, I decided to go grab some firewood and relieve myself down by the bank of the river, just out of reach of the light from the campfire. Out from the tree line about 15 yards away, I could hear rustling in the bushes. I watched the area where I heard the noise and focused on that spot. I felt kind of funny, dizzy/lightheaded, and I could smell this putrid stink like old milk or rotten food. Then I saw the trees start to morph and move ever so slightly and began to take the shape of a head and slight facial features. My eyes began to adjust to the darkness and along the tree line. I could hear this voice coming from there. I recognized it. The voice sounded like one of my relatives who had recently passed. The face took shape of my relative. "Hello," they said. "I've missed you. Come see me." I smiled and stepped forward a bit, but stopped to analyze the situation. My relative's face stopped smiling and became emotionless. The skin began to turn pale and peel away. Chunks of flesh from their cheeks began to fall away, and I felt shock and fear overwhelm my body. I couldn't make sense of it at all, so I started to back away and make my way to camp. I didn't realize at the time that I had been walking towards the voice, and I was further away from the firelight. The voice became angry and began shouting at me to come here, so I turned to run away, but as I looked back one more time, I saw the most disgusting thing I had ever seen. It was rotting flesh on gnawed bone, caved-in eyes, and a hollow chest cavity. This humanoid creature was tall and super thin. I ran as fast as I could, trying to yell for help, but the fear had made my voice quiet and raspy. I ran along the river bank, and I could hear the heavy breaths and the stomping feet from this thing right behind me. I made it onto the top of the river bank, but it grabbed a hold of my leg as I jumped up. I gripped and tore the grass, trying to lift myself, and yelled as loud as I could. Then finally my voice came back, and I yelled that someone has my leg. My brother woke up and ran over to where I was then. He pulled me up and took me over to the fire. I was terrified, trying to explain what I saw and that it looked like my relative, but not. I was trying to convince them that I wasn't seeing things, but my brother nodded his head and said, "I saw it too, I know." That solidified it. He acknowledged that it was real. We stayed up all night after that, rifles loaded and close by. We packed up when the sun was coming up and went back home. We haven't shared that story with anyone out of fear of being labeled as crazy or liars. I've had nightmares and couldn't sleep for months afterwards. I would see things / dark figures looking into my window or hear whispers when I was walking home at night. Eventually, I was seeing this dark figure daily. I went to medicine men / shaman for help, but I've learned that the ceremonies only relieves it temporarily. Friends have given me everything from protection pouches to certain crystals. I found out that there's a strong possibility that I encountered a Wendigo. I learned that if you encounter one and survive, it attaches itself to you like a parasite. I learned that it could only do this if it touches you, which it did. Ever since that night, I've been on edge when I enter any forest or wooded area, which sucks because I loved being outdoors/hunting and in nature. Now, I always feel like I need to keep my back against something when I'm out in the wild. Fifth story. Something in the woods called back to me. All right, here it goes. I've never posted here before, but what happened to me last weekend still has me rattled. I need to get it off my chest, and maybe, just maybe, someone here can help me make sense of it. I live in a small town in Montana, nestled in the Rockies. My house is just a few miles from a vast expanse of national forest land. It's beautiful, sure, but it can be incredibly isolating. That isolation is part of why I love it, but after what happened, it's also why I'm terrified. Last Saturday, I decided to take a late afternoon hike. There's a trail I frequent, one that winds up to a small clearing overlooking the valley. I brought my dog, Max, a German Shepherd who's never been spooked by anything in his life. We set off around 3 p.m., figuring we'd be back before sunset. The hike up was uneventful. The forest was serene, and the only sounds were the rustling of leaves and the occasional chirping of birds. Max was his usual self, darting ahead and then circling back to me. It was perfect, exactly why I moved out here. When we reached the clearing, I sat down on a fallen log to catch my breath and enjoy the view. Max was sniffing around, but after a few minutes he froze. He was staring at the tree line on the opposite side of the clearing, his ears perked up and his body tense. "What's up, boy?" I asked, trying to see what he was looking at. That's when I noticed it. At first, it was just a shadow moving between the trees. I squinted, thinking maybe it was a deer or something, but then it stepped out into the clearing. It looked like a person, but not quite. It was tall and gaunt, with limbs that seemed too long for its body. Its skin was pale, almost grayish, and its eyes were completely black. Max started growling, a low, menacing sound that I'd never heard from him before. The figure took a step forward, and that's when I noticed it was mimicking my movements from earlier, almost like it was replaying a tape of me walking. Then it spoke. "Max, what's up, boy?" The voice was mine. Exactly mine. I felt a chill run down my spine, and Max started barking furiously. The figure stopped, tilted its head, and then turned around, disappearing back into the trees. I didn't stick around to see if it would come back. I grabbed Max by the collar and practically ran down the trail. It was getting dark, and every sound made me jump. Max kept looking back, growling intermittently. We made it home just as the last light was fading. I locked all the doors and windows, something I rarely do out here. I tried to calm myself down, rationalizing that maybe it was just some sort of trick of the light, or maybe another hiker messing with me. But deep down, I knew that wasn't it. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the house made me jump, and Max was restless, pacing around the living room. Around 2 a.m., just as I was starting to doze off, I heard it. "Max, what's up, boy?" It was faint, almost like a whisper, but it was definitely my voice. It was coming from outside, near the tree line. I didn't sleep at all after that. When the sun finally came up, I took Max and drove into town. I needed to be around people, somewhere that didn't feel so exposed. I told my friend Jake about it, and he just laughed, saying I'd been out in the woods too long. Maybe he's right. Maybe it was just my mind playing tricks on me. But I can't shake the feeling that something out there saw me, remembered me, and called back in my own voice. I haven't been back to that trail since. Every time I think about going for a hike, I hear that voice again, and I can't bring myself to leave the house. I don't know what I saw, but I'm sure of one thing. It saw me too. Has anyone else experienced something like this? I need to know I'm not losing my mind. Sixth story. I found a body in the woods. I shouldn't have brought it home. It was the last day of fall, the very last brown leaves rattling on the oaks lining the back hill. I'd been out fixing a spot where the fire road had started to fall away. The property is 60 acres, most of it wild and crowded with ticks and poison oak. Even though I've lived here 20 years, there are places I've never walked. When I bought the land, I heard there was a spring somewhere up the mountain where the deer gather, but I've never seen it. As you might guess, I lived way the hell out of town, past the point where even the main roads turn to gravel, and then to dirt. Never once have I seen another person here, unless I invited them, and I didn't hand out too many invitations. I was just finishing up work when I spotted something strange in the nearby brush, a flash of orange. At first, I thought it might be a fallen leaf, still holding on to its last bits of color. But as I looked closer, I saw it was bigger, a hunting vest. I called out a hello and got no response. I cursed and spat, wishing I'd brought my shotgun. It wouldn't have been impossible for some lost hiker on the PCT to end up here, or some drifter wandering for miles out of town. I called out again and was met with silence. The cold wind rattled the leaves. I could tell snow was on the way. I could have left it there, of course, but it was my land after all. Slowly, I approached the orange thing. Then, as I reached it, I almost gagged. What I found was a body, fully intact except for the head, which was missing. There was no pool of blood, though. Stupidly, I bent closer and saw something that made me gag. Where there should have been a bloody stump, I instead found smooth skin covering the entirety of the severed neck. It was as if the body had been born headless with clean, unscarred skin covering the top of the neck where the head would normally go. The first snowflakes of winter began to fall against my back as I tried to figure out what to make of this impossible corpse. I had no way of knowing how long it had been there. It seemed fresh, maybe due to the cold weather. The hands were cool to the touch, pale and drained of blood, but they didn't show any signs of rot. Oddly, though, when I rolled up the sleeve, the skin looked slightly darker than the hand, almost like they belonged to two different people. I turned the boldly slightly to look at the other arm. It was yet another color, none of it matching. I told myself maybe it was a weird tan. Maybe he'd been wearing gloves at some point or a one-sleeve shirt. Maybe he'd had some kind of illness. I could have left the body there. But that would likely mean leaving it for the duration of the winter, 3 or 4 months under a few feet of snow. And who knows what condition it would be in when that time was over. I probably should have called the county sheriff, but there were a few plants on my land I didn't want him to see, not to mention some code violations. Finally, I decided that I'd be best off bringing the thing back to the house and disposing of it later, probably dumping it in a park somewhere so that it could be discovered by somebody else. With some effort, I hauled the body over to a cart I'd hooked onto my four-wheeler. Then I hauled ass back to the main house before the snow started to stick. I had an uninsulated basement attached to the house, only accessible by a single staircase through the kitchen. It mostly kept the pests out and was good for storing some tools and a few dry goods. I dragged the body into there for the night, where it could stay cold but would be protected from the elements, not to mention the bears. Then I washed up and heated up a can of red beans on my cook stove before settling in to watch the news. The sick thought occurred to me that this was my first time having company in a few years. Maybe an hour passed, and I got to drinking. Then, as I was heading to the kitchen for another beer, I thought I heard something. A little thump, followed by a kind of dragging sound. Of course, being out in the woods, animals were jumping on the roof all the time, but this sound had come from below. And if I'm being honest, seeing the body had set me a little on edge, even if I didn't want to admit it. I picked up my shotgun and walked slowly to the basement door, trying not to make a sound. I was trying to breathe slow, like in those yoga videos they advertise on the Home Shopping Network. Peering down the stairs, I could barely see the body's 2 feet near the bottom of the stairs, except that I could have sworn I left the body clear down at the other side of the room. "Hello?" I called down into the darkness. "Hello?" There was no response, of course, so I shut the door and started back toward the living room. Outside, the snow was falling harder now, piling up on the dirt road. By morning, I'd be here for the duration, on my own until the March thaw. The sun began to slip over the far mountains, throwing a shadow over everything, almost like night. Before I could sit back down again, I heard another thump, and then another. I walked back to the door, but something in me refused to open it this time. Instead, I locked it. As I did, I heard a few more thumps, each one growing closer. And then the handle began to rattle. I took a step back, and then another as the rattling began to grow more urgent. "Go away!" I shouted. "Get!" But whatever it was didn't listen. Loud kicks began to sound from the bottom of the door, where the wood was beginning to buckle and splinter. I leveled my gun at the door and fired. Then I heard several thumps as something fell down the stairs. For a moment, I just stood there. I definitely wasn't doing any yoga breathing now. My heart was going so fast that it sent a tingle down my left arm. For a moment, everything was silent. My ears rang from the shotgun blast, and the air reeked of gunpowder. Then, I began to hear the thumps again. First one, then another as the thing made its way back up the stairs. Part of me wanted to shoot it again to stand my ground, to defend my castle. But then I thought better of the idea. If one shotgun blast through the door didn't finish the thing, I figured a second shot wasn't going to do much better. So for the first time in my life, I ran. I sprinted to the four-wheeler and unhitched the cart. As I did, I looked up into the house where I saw the thing standing there. As I watched, it walked across the living room and sat down in the chair I'd occupied just a few minutes earlier. If it had eyes, I suppose it would have watched TV. I drove through the storm. There were a few hairy moments, but for the most part one didn't hit much trouble. The whole time, though, I couldn't stop looking over my shoulder, as if the thing were sprinting after me, running blindly through the snow like it would catch me any second. Finally, when I hit the main road, I felt like I could breathe again. I didn't stop driving until I was all the way downtown. I'm not sure why, but the first thing I did was to walk into the most crowded bar I could find and order a beer. It's funny, it had been maybe 6 months since the last time I'd talked to anyone, but suddenly it was all I wanted to do. And for the next few hours, I flapped my gums at anyone who would listen, telling every story I knew, every one except the one I'm telling you now. I never did go back to the property. I sold it to some rich man from California. I heard he demolished my old cabin, put in some kind of metal and glass fortress. Maybe that'll keep him safe. As for me, I don't ever plan on living out there again, especially after what happened to my neighbor, Kevin. See, a few nights after I left, the sheriff got a frantic call from Kevin's wife, who had been out of town. She'd just gotten back to her house during a break in the weather. When she did, she found her husband's body, except it was missing a head. According to the coroner, it had been ripped off its body. Of course, they said it was a bear. But what kind of bear just takes a head and leaves the rest of the kill untouched, uneaten? I've got no idea what the thing wanted with a severed head. Maybe it was just jealous. Maybe it wanted to wear it like a hat. And then I remember the way those skin tones didn't match on the arms and hands. I wonder, maybe if the thing started as nothing at all, If it slowly put itself together out of all the lonely old men in the woods, all the guys like me that thought we didn't need anyone. At night, I imagine a lot of things. I imagine my own neck ripping at the seams, and then I have to force myself out of bed. I sprint out into the street, running and running until I see another human being, desperate to talk to anyone, willing to do anything for a little company, anything to not be alone. Seventh story. I think something tried to lure me into the woods tonight. I can't sleep at all since this happened, and I'm honestly not sure who else to share this with because I think I'll sound crazy, but I have to get this out there because it's been running through my head, and I'm so chilled and mortified. I live on this big piece of sort of small farmland with two homes, the house my husband and I live in, and the house that is owned by his grandparents a short walking distance away. We have a lot of woods surrounding our land, and we get a lot of woodland animals that come through our yard a lot. It's one thing I really love about living here. There's a groundhog family I've got to watch grow up that live by one of our sheds that mind their own business and don't bother any of the small crops my husband's Nana grows. Anyways, our dogs kinda just know the territory and walk around freely between our two homes and the large field. I guess you could call them farm dogs, but they don't really do anything. My dog is a three-legged, 15-year-old Chihuahua that manages to get around better than me somehow, and Nana's really fat beagle who would lick you to death. We're also dog-sitting my mother-in-law's big dog for 4th of July weekend since she's going to be somewhere with lots of fireworks. He really doesn't like them, and he's familiar with our home. So last night, I came out of the bathroom, and the big dog starts freaking out. Like whining, howling, kind of stomping his feet like he wants to show me something, if that makes sense. This isn't really unusual for him, because he gets pretty mouthy when he wants outside. So I started going towards the door, which then he started gesturing with his head towards. So I opened the wooden door before our screen door, and he just froze in our kitchen like a statue. My dog then came up behind him and froze too. They both stared directly at me and turned their heads towards the door in sync, like they were gesturing for me to go outside. It was so uniform. I don't know how to describe it. Like it just felt so wrong for them to do, but at the same time I assumed maybe there was a skunk outside or something. I went out onto the porch to see our grand neighbor's dog sitting happily on our porch, which made me relax a little. There were very distant sounds of fireworks, so I thought maybe that's what our dogs were on edge about. Then the fat beagle on the porch did the same thing. Looked at me, nodded his head towards the woods like a suggestion. I noticed he was sitting uncharacteristically still and wasn't panting and snoring like he usually does. I walked to the edge of the porch and looked around for a bit. Eventually my eyes landed at this one spot, a perfect hole between the trees that allowed me to stare back deeper into the woods a little bit. And in that spot, I saw a pair of eyes open and blink at me. The rest is kind of a haze. I just remember thinking you need to go to the woods over and over again while urging myself not to do it, like I was having a battle with a rope pulling me. It suddenly looked like there was grass that was laid perfectly for me to walk on, like I could point out spots that had been tread on by feet before. The best way I can describe it is like that one Junji Ito story about the fault where people were being lured into their holes. It was like there was a path made for me to walk to this pair of white eyes staring at me from the woods. My husband noticed something was amiss. I guess because he heard the door open and wasn't sure where I was. I always tell him when I go outside to read/sit on the porch for a while. And I just kind of heard him behind me go, "What are you doing?" I remember saying, "I'm just looking." I specifically remember saying that. I would bet money on it that those words left my mouth. My husband kind of started getting worried and started guiding me inside. But I remember saying, "I'm just looking." He finally ushered me inside and shut the door, turned around wide-eyed and kind of questioned, You do not need to go out into the woods?" I was really confused. From what I remembered, from his perspective, what he should have seen was me standing on the porch staring into the woods. I never mentioned anything about walking out there, just had the sensation that I should move. It was then he told me that apparently I kept looking out like I was in a trance and saying different variations of, I need to walk out into the woods for a little bit. I have no recollection of this at all. I've had weird things happen to me before, but this truly fills me with dread. I don't understand what happened, and I'm honestly really frightened about any of us going outside alone for a bit. I really feel like there's something trying to lure us into the woods or something. 8th story. My wife and I found a door in the middle of the woods. What the hell? What is it, honey? My wife's voice called out from behind me. It's a door. She laughed. Did you break into the pot stash early? We're in the middle of the woods. Why would there be a Karen stopped as she saw it, and we stood shoulder to shoulder looking at it, an old wooden door built into the side of a hill in the middle of nowhere. It really is crazy what you can find out on these expeditions sometimes, honey. She grinned. Should we knock? I shook my head. I'm not really sure I want to meet the kind of person that lives inside a hill. Oh, come on. Karen punched my shoulder. Where's your sense of adventure? Karen strode up to the door and gave it a polite knock. Hello, I'm looking for a Mr. Beard. A Mr. Tree Beard? I chuckled as I shook my head. Karen never let me forget the little wonderful things about her that made me fall in love with her. She turned to me in mock disappointment. I don't think anybody's home, honey, she said. All right, come on. I said, we've got enough shrooms for now. Let's find a good place to trip. Are you kidding? God, I married the most boring man in the universe. We got to go inside. What if someone lives there? What if somebody lives in a hill in the woods? I think the man who built his house underground in a forest will be understanding if we offer to share some of our pot with him. You assume that just because he lives in a hill he smokes pot? I don't know, Karen, that's pretty racist. Racist? Against who? Tree people, obviously. Who else? Karen laughed and punched me in the shoulder again. I feigned being hurt, even though I loved it when she did that. All right, I finally agreed. After all, if I didn't completely ignore common sense sometimes, I wouldn't be married to you in the first place. You're really funny. After I kick you out of the house, maybe you can live with Mr. Tree Beard out here in the woods. I chuckled and tried the knob. The door was unlocked. As we pushed it open, we were greeted by a damp, mossy smell. The room inside was pitch black, but it seemed to be made entirely of rock, not dirt like I had expected. Hold on a second, I said, sliding the pack off onto the ground and fumbling around inside for the flashlight. I flipped it on and scanned the walls. What the? The walls were all covered in some sort of nonsensical carvings. It reminded me of when we'd studied Egyptian hieroglyphics in school. What is this, wingdings? Karen joked. I didn't answer. I had gotten the sudden feeling that I was being watched. I swung the flashlight to the back wall, only to discover that there wasn't one. The passage continued on and sloped downwards until the flashlight beam ended on the ceiling about 30 feet away. Karen, I think we should dash. Hold on, what's that? Karen pointed to a dark spot on the floor, and I pointed the flashlight down to illuminate it. It was some kind of black liquid. Motor oil? I joked, but Karen's wasn't joking around. She knelt down to look at the puddle. It's blood, Danny, she said. And look, it's leading down inside. I tilted the flashlight up. She was right. There was a blood trail leading deeper into the cavern. It's probably just an animal, I said. We should go. But Karen was already tying her hair up the way she did at work. She cupped her hands to her mouth. Hello, she called out. I heard the call echo down the chamber, which must have been much larger than we had originally thought. Is anybody down there? Silence. But then, a barely audible call answered. H, help. The call sounded like it was coming from deep within the cavern. When I heard it, all the hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and there was a sinking feeling in my chest. My every instinct started telling me to get the fuck out of this place. Karen, it could be some sort of trap, I said. Let's call the park rangers and then get the fuck out of here. Somebody's hurt down there, Danny, she said sternly. But then her expression softened a bit. Sorry, honey. This is what you got yourself into when you decided to marry a nurse. I sighed. I knew there was no stopping Karen once she had set her mind to do something, but I kept a tight grip on the heavy mag flashlight as we proceeded down the passageway. The blood trail got thinner as we walked deeper into the cavern. Whoever it was must have lost most of their blood in the antechamber. But if they were hurt out there, why had they retreated further into the cavern? Why not go outside where they had a chance of being found? It didn't make any sense. The air grew hotter and more humid as we went further down the increasingly steep slope, and a pungent smell of mold invaded our nostrils. I coughed as I breathed the horrid air. Where did all this dust come from? The deeper sections of the cavern walls had been cracked open by tree roots that had burrowed their way through the stone. What the fuck is this place? I whispered to Karen. Maybe some sort of makeshift survival bunker? She guessed. She cupped her hands to her mouth again. Hello. Her shout echoed down the hallway. If you can hear us, stay calm. We're going to help you get out to safety. Help. The voice was a little louder this time. We must be getting closer, I thought. But the sense of revulsion I felt on hearing the voice only got worse. Did she not feel it? As we went deeper inside, we found where the blood trail ended. There was a long smear of it on the ground. It looked like somebody had been dragged across the floor while bleeding heavily. And then it just stopped. Not even a drop after that. The walls of the cavern had now been almost completely overrun by roots, and breathing was getting difficult as the air had grown hotter and more choked with dust. Help! The voice was very close now, and I could now make it out more clearly. It sounded strange, all breathy and raspy, like a crude imitation of what a person should sound like. The floor had now become so steep it was impossible to go any further without risking a fall into God knows what. We got to get down to him somehow. Karen wheezed out. She must have been having even more trouble breathing in the hot, thick dust than me. I got it, I said. You step back. I pulled out the length of rope we'd brought in our emergency gear and tied it to one of the thick roots springing through the walls of the cave. I gave it a few firm tugs to make sure it was secure before tying the other end around my waist. I never wanted to turn around and go home so badly, but I knew there was no way Karen would leave without seeing this through. I started the climb down carefully, leaning over and moving the flashlight around to try to see what was going on without slipping and falling. I could see the vague outline of a man in the darkness, and I swung the flashlight beam over him. My blood went cold. Can't run? What? Run! My breath was knocked out as the rope yanked back against my waist. I hoped it was Karen pulling, but I knew it wasn't. She wasn't that strong. I landed on the ground hard, and the rope continued to pull me backwards. Danny, what the fuck is Dash? Run, goddammit. She started to back away as the roots on the walls all started to move, slowly snaking their way towards us. I sawed through the rope with my pocket knife and stumbled forward into a sprint, yanking Karen along with me. She wouldn't have hesitated if she'd seen what I had. At the bottom of the cavern, a man had been suspended above the ground in a giant web of roots that were writhing and sliding through him. Little bulges were moving slowly up the roots that led away from his collapsed and shriveled body, one root jutting into his throat and twisting around every time he called for help. The plant was working his voice box like a puppet. We abandoned our flashlight and gear bag in the cave behind us as we sprinted towards the exit in total darkness, hacking and coughing as the moldy, dusty air of the cavern filled our lungs. I could feel myself tripping on roots that had not been there on the way in. I felt a yank on my hand as Karen fell, and we both tumbled down onto the writhing roots which circled around our limbs and began to drag us backwards. I started hacking desperately at them with my pocket knife. The roots recoiled as I struck them, and I managed to free my legs. I pulled at Karen's hands, but the roots were stronger. "Just leave me," she shouted at me. "Fuck no." I swung blindly at her legs, and the knife connected with a sick thud. I swung a dozen more times, slashing her legs once by mistake before she was loose enough to yank free. We kept running towards the door, and I could feel the air getting cooler and fresher, and the floor beginning to level out. We'd almost made it. I could see the outline of light around the door now. We ran full force into it, ricocheting off and bouncing back onto the ground. I scrambled up. "Please be open." I grabbed the knob and yanked, and a torrent of fresh air and sunlight poured into the cavern. I grabbed Karen's arm and half dragged her through open door before collapsing exhausted on the ground. "We made it," I gasped out. My chest was heaving up and down as I lay on my back, coughing up all the dust from the cavern air. "Yeah." Karen was bright red with exhaustion, her arms and legs covered in scratch marks. I don't imagine I looked much better. "What the fuck was that?" I said breathlessly, getting to my feet. Karen shook her head. "I don't know, but let's get the fuck out of here." I helped Karen to her feet, and we both stood there panting and coughing with our hands on our knees. Karen coughed something up into her hand. "Danny," she said, showing it to me. It was a small leaf. I watched her face as little green tendrils began to spread out and coil around under her skin, and I realized with horror that it hadn't been dust we were breathing in. It had been spores. Thanks a lot for watching the video till the end. Subscribe to our channel Horror in Detail. Drop your opinions/suggestions in the comment section, and like the video as it helps with the YouTube algorithm.